And happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday to you.
I
as
have a
well.
new rule.
A new rule.
Yeah, instituting a new rule today. And it's not for everybody, just for me. The new rule is this, that when it's 113 or warmer, I cease to tuck in my shirt.
Yeah.
I am not tucking my shirt in when it's 113 or hotter.
It got to that point where
It's too much.
when it cooled down for that little bit, and then it warmed back up again.
You know, when it was 109 and it was cool? Yes,
Yeah.
then.
Yes. Yes. Now, like, all
Bets are off.
All bets are off. Kind of do what you want.
And when he
That's
says
it.
that, that's the theological way of saying all hope is gone.
All hope
It's gone.
has been lost.
It will never be cool again. We had second fall at the beginning of August, end of July, and it's all gone, and it's never coming back.
It'll come back.
It will.
We're going to get there.
Yep.
We're
But
gonna get
until
there.
we get below 113, I'm not tucking my shirt in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just, I need to be free. I
Well-
just got to be me.
Just got to be you.
Yeah. So you'll have to do the shirt tucking around here for a while.
I moved to polos because they're just that
Yeah.
that little bit cooler.
Yep.
You're long sleeves.
I know, right?
It's hardcore.
And here's the thing about men's what do you want to call it? Haberdashery.
That's what I would call it.
Haberdashery. That's an old term for you. When you wear a long sleeve shirt like this, even with the sleeves rolled up, my dad taught me you always wear a t-shirt underneath. And so, yes, I'm also at 2 layers.
Yeah. And that's where it just gets a little bit.
It's a little much. It's like wearing chainmail here in the desert.
Chainmail in the desert.
It's like wearing armor. So I got a couple of stories for you.
Okay.
Story number 1 is we had some friends come into town to see the Grateful Dead.
That's right. We actually mentioned them. What was that, on Thursday?
Yeah. So, and as I
And
said, they didn't come
They
to see
weren't in
us.
yet, but they
They did come.
They did come.
They didn't come to see us, but because they were in town to see the Grateful Dead, they did set up a time to visit with us. Okay.
Great.
So they come over on Sunday night, and we really tried to convince them to meet us somewhere for dinner because we knew that cooking a full meal for 8 people means you're going to heat up your whole house.
It does, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah.
no matter what, you just...
Yeah. So we couldn't get the house any cooler than like 79 degrees once we started cooking and got people in the house. Like, it was like 3 a.m. when the house finally got back to temp. Anyways, so we cooked dinner and it's fine. Talking to our friends, and we asked them what they did earlier in the day. I said, well, we were sightseeing, and we decided to go hiking at Red Rock Canyon. And I looked at them, and I'm like, in 110 degrees? Like, well, yeah, it was just, like, we weren't there that long. I'm like, I'm not surprised. Like, the rest of the world does that from October to, like, maybe May. Like,
Yeah.
the rest of us do not go out and walk around Red Rock Canyon in August.
Oh, man. So...
They even brought, like, hiking stuff or climbing stuff, and they're like, yeah, no, we're not climbing 110 degrees.
You can go up to Charleston.
Yeah,
It's
you can do
not
that.
too bad.
The closest I get to Red Rock Canyon in the summer is the chapel
There you go.
with our Red Rock Canyon Calico Basin picture.
Yeah, don't share this with
Yeah,
anybody
just
else.
keep it between yourselves, right.
At all. But I once, there were a few kids from the youth group who, this was years ago now, they wanted me to take them hiking in Red Rock, and it was
Summer.
It was summer. It was
Yeah.
a warm day.
Yeah.
And I had said, like, hey, we'll get a little group together. We'll
Yeah.
go. And this was they were strong hikers, right?
Okay, so they
were.
had some experience, right?
Yeah. And so I took them out hiking, and there was vomiting before we even reached the rock. Like,
'Cause of the
that
heat and
because of the heat. Like,
Yeah.
before we reached our scrambling point.
Yeah.
It was one of those where it's like,
You know what the miracle is? The miracle in that story is this. that you kept it out of the RJ.
We did keep it out of the RJ. I didn't.
We don't
go
need to
on
be
and-
like advertising
No,
this.
we didn't. We didn't brag about that one.
Yeah,
a
it was
whole
only
lot.
about $8,000 in helicopter medevac, but other than that,
No, we
it was
got
a
everybody out of there
successful trip.
just fine, and everybody turned out great.
And rehydrated,
Yes, I brought along plenty of water that we
consumed, and cooled off with.
consumed and dumped on people
Yeah.
to try to cool them down.
That's good. Lesson
Yeah.
learned, huh?
Yeah, I'm not taking a youth group hike
In the summer
Red
again.
Rock in
Again,
the summer.
yeah.
No.
Here's the second part of the story. So
Okay.
we're off the hiking thing now.
Yes.
So my friend Ken, who of the husband and wife, Ken says to me, he said, I was coming out here and I have a friend of somebody I grew up with that moved to Southern California. And he says, I know we're not in Southern California, but I decided to look them up because I knew it was coming out west, right? And so he's fallen out of contact with this person. And so he does what sometimes one might do if you're on Facebook, is you just do a search of a name
Okay.
to see if he can find this person and friend them and then say, hey, I'm going to be in Las Vegas, blah, blah, blah. So he tells me he starts searching for this person, and he said, and amazingly enough, only 2 names popped up as opposed to like 100 or 1,000 or, If
Okay, so
you've ever gone
there's
looking
a-
for somebody on Facebook that are not your friends, there's a lot of people with the same name out there.
Yeah.
So he sees 2. He said, but one of them has friends. He's looking at both profiles. One of them has friends that have 7 mutual friends, not of him, but of somebody that Ken knows, specifically me.
Okay.
So he's like, what is this? Could this be the person? So he looks and he sees 7 of their friends are friends with me. I don't know who this person is, by the way. And so he sends them a message. They start talking. And then he asks, he's like, I was trying to hunt you down, and I saw on your Facebook profile that 7 of your friends are connected to Ben.
Pastor over here.
Yeah.
Yes.
And she says, oh, that's the pastor at Community Lutheran Church. And some of my friends live in Las Vegas and go there, and they love that church, and they love their pastor.
Wow.
And I didn't ask. I didn't say,
Wow.
open your phone, let me see who her friends are. I didn't do any of that. Because, like, who's telling stories, right? But how fascinating, what a small world
Yeah, that is.
that Ken's long-lost friend who moved to Southern California has 7 friends who attend here and love this church. I mean,
That is
what
really cool. Yeah.
well, that's like 6
It-
degrees
it-
of separation,
It is.
right?
Like it's separated though by a fair ways that you wouldn't necessarily.
Yeah. So it's a small Facebook world out there when my friend from Indiana has a friend in Southern California, and their friends are Facebook friends / church members here. Like, go figure, right?
Yeah.
You just never
Yeah.
know. So, well, so we had a nice evening though. All in all, we had a nice evening. It was great to see them because it had been since 2019 was the last time we saw them. So, yeah. So that was the.
That's great. Yeah. Always
Amazing.
always nice when you can connect with people.
That's exactly right.
And yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And if you didn't tune in or were in the room, we did have our congregational meeting on Sunday and reviewed the finances for the first 6 months of the year. And you get to the end of June, that's 6 months, and our deficit is only $2,700.
And we talked about everything, where that
at
comes
that-
from, and,
yep,
and
yep.
what was expected, because that's just doing all right for end of the summer.
That's right. So I'll probably write a little, not as in depth as the meeting was, but I will absolutely put a little kind of review into the weekly email that comes out on Friday, a much more abbreviated version, so that if you didn't make it to the meeting or didn't see it online when it was there, you'll get a snapshot of that. So
Yeah, that'd be great.
And did you notice we have some new decorations here?
I did notice that.
Yep.
Fantastic.
Yep, and thank you, Susan, for getting these out for us. I think I'm going to set up a hummingbird feeder to see if we can attract any hummingbirds to live in the bird house here. What do you think? Think we could attract some if we put out some sugar water?
Well,
I mean, it's a
No.
long haul from outside down into the basement and then unlock the studio doors and come in. But once you're in, it's climate controlled.
that's true.
And I'm willing to cover the
They
sugar
really don't
water.
seem to be too bothered by the heat. You see them
I noticed
zipping
that.
around out there.
Yep, yep. And they're still coming. We have a feeder at our house. And we
113, it doesn't
yeah,
matter.
they
just go
as
for
long
it.
as long as you got the sugar water out,
They like that.
they love that. And
Yeah.
and we
Just
have
don't spill the sugar water all over in here again.
no, I know that last
hate it
time.
when you do that.
I know it's such a mess and oof.
Yeah.
And then using the carpet cleaner and and then I'm running over these cables with electricity
I know.
with the water.
I
and
just
the-
I don't need to deal with that again.
yeah. I mean that's why Linda puts a lid on my iced tea. It's like a kid's sippy cup.
Yeah.
Because I need that.
It's
so,
appropriate.
So this past weekend, we finished off our KCLC radio sermon series, and we did that song, "We Are the World."
We are the world.
We're not going to hear that one today.
We had other songs.
We had
this
other
weekend
songs. Yeah,
as well.
we had more than one song this weekend, right? Like every week. And but we did at every service this weekend, beyond "We Are the World," had either the full version or a little snippet of a classic, what I'd consider gospel type hymn. And even 11 o'clock had one verse and one chorus of this hymn. So at all four services
Oh,
we
absolutely, yeah.
we had some sort of placement for this hymn. And so what we're going to do is we haven't done a kind of a classic hymn in a while, and there's a great story to this hymn.
Oh.
And so we're going to go back to Saturday night service where Robbie Wingfield and the Honky Tonk Angels did this hymn, and I'm sure some of you will know this hymn. So let's take a listen. We'll talk about it when we come back.
Why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows come? Why should my heart be lonely and long for heaven and home? When Jesus is my portion, my constant friend is He. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. Sing with me. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. For His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. Let not your heart be troubled. His tender words I hear, and resting on His goodness, I lose my doubt and fear. Though by the path He leadeth, but one step I may see. His eyes on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. Yeah. His eyes on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. For His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. Whenever I am tempted, whenever clouds arise, when songs give place to sighing, when hope within me dies. I draw the closer to him. From care he sets me free, for his eye is on the sparrow, and I know that he watches me. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. Come on, sing it out. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. For his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. Yeah. I sing because I'm happy, and I sing because I'm free, for his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me.
Amen. It's a great version of that hymn.
Yeah.
And Dana did another wonderful version of it at 8 and 9:30, and then Robbie revisited this a little bit at 11 on Sunday too. So just
It is. It's one that even though it's not in the the church hymnal or anything that I grew up with, it's still a very familiar hymn.
That's
So
right.
many different people, so many different backgrounds.
Yeah, and so when you say that, it's like one of those things is we kind of have a set, and we did this year, a set of core Lutheran hymnal hymns of a list that we've created. But then we also have kind of, I wouldn't call it an addendum, but great classic hymns like this one that are in that list too, that should be in our hymnal, but for some reason they're not, right? Yeah. And we haven't done this one in quite a while at kind of the wider range of our services. But get this, what would you believe it if I told you that the person who wrote this hymn was born in Nova Scotia, Canada?
Nova Scotia.
Yeah, Nova Scotia, Canada.
Wow.
Because you hear this, and one of the possible conclusions after hearing or knowing this hymn is you say, it is a spiritual. And I wouldn't disagree, but it doesn't come from that kind of provenance.
Okay.
The woman who wrote this, her name was Sevilla Durfee Martin. Now that they don't have names like that anymore.
No.
Sevilla, yeah, not to be confused with Cruella.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Don't go there, right? Sevilla. Now that I told you, names like Zerubbabel, Shamgar.
Here's another one.
Sevilla could work for a boy or a girl.
I suppose you're right.
I'm just throwing it
suppose
out
you're
there. I
right,
mean,
yeah.
there is a baby coming, so
There is a baby coming.
I'm helping. Sevilla Durfee Martin, born in Nova Scotia, but at the end of her life, she was living in Atlanta, Georgia. But she wrote His Eyes on the Sparrow in 1905, so almost kind of like smack dab in the middle of her life.
Yeah.
And and it's not a stretch to say one of the most influential, if not recorded, gospel hymns. I mean, it's just a common, well-known hymn, and it draws on a couple of things. One, Matthew 6:26. Look at the birds of the air; they neither reap nor sow nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not more valuable than they? I mean, that's
The beautiful passage there
Yeah.
in the scriptures
of God
And-
saying, Jesus saying, God cares for you more than the birds, and God takes care of the birds.
Right.
And then of course in Matthew 10:29, are not two sparrows sold for a penny at the temple, yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from the will of your Father. So there's some of the inspiration to him, right? But how did it get written? This is from her own words. So I always love it when we have an old hymn and we have the person who actually wrote it tell the story. as opposed to somebody like, I did a bunch of research and we think this is it. Like, this is coming from Sevilla herself.
Yeah.
I love this.
Yes, okay.
So I'm going to read this to you only because it's her words and I want to convey this. It said, early in the spring of 1905, my husband and I were sojourning to Elmira, New York. So next time I go out of town, I'm going to go
You're gonna
sojourning.
sojourn, yeah.
That's another lost word that we need to use more. So she's going to Elmira, New York, and she said we contracted a deep friendship for a couple by the name of Mr. and Mrs. Doolittle, true saints of God. This is her description. Mrs. Doolittle had been bedridden for nearly 20 years. Her husband was an incurable cripple who had to propel himself to and from his business in a wheelchair. This is all language from, old.
Yeah.
We don't use language like that anymore, but that's the words they used back then. She said, despite their afflictions, they lived happy Christian lives, bringing inspiration and comfort to all who knew them. So one day, while we were visiting with the Doolittles, my husband commented on their bright hopefulness and asked them for the secret of it. Mrs. Doolittle's response was simple. Listen to this. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. That's what this woman said. The beauty of this simple expression and boundless faith gripped the hearts and fired the imagination of her husband, Dr. Martin, and me, she says. The hymn, His Eyes on the Sparrow, was the outcome of that experience. The next day, she mailed the poem, because we've talked about this before, a lot of hymns begin as poems or as prose and then music. So she mailed the poem to somebody by the name of Charles Gabriel, a famous composer of gospel songs who wrote a tune for it. And that's how it happened. So think about the fact that Sevilla is visiting these friends of theirs who have a very hard life,
Yeah,
health-wise.
it sounds like it would have been a very difficult life.
And yet they're happy, they're joyful, they're at peace. And her husband says, what's the secret through all of the struggle you have? And she just says, his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. And Sevilla, being this creative writer, wrote, went, probably to her room, she was probably staying with them, and wrote this out.
Yeah.
And wow. So what a story, right?
That's a great story and great perspective to be able to see that.
Yeah. And the humility to say, I didn't come up with that. Mrs. Doolittle did.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's the other thing. It's not like, oh, I wrote it and I had all these, she's like, the inspiration came from this person and what they said. That's true humility, right?
Yeah.
I love that. So what I did was I took a few of the lines from the song and paired it with some Bible verses today. First verse, right? Why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows come? Why should my heart be lonely and long for heaven and home? So it's this questioning, why am I in a place where I'm not where I want to be? For any number of reasons. And I went to Job, and Job's the story of the guy who lost everything and struggled with losing everything. And he didn't lose faith, but man, was he discouraged.
Yeah.
And in Job chapter 4, verse 5, listen to this. Now your trouble comes to you, and you're discouraged. It strikes you, and you're dismayed. And then here's the response. Should not your piety be your confidence, and your blameless ways your hope? So you might go, what does that mean? Piety is a word that has fallen out of use in religious circles. It was very much used really mid-20th century and earlier, talking about one's piety, one's connection to God. And part of piety is one's reverence for God and one's humility in relation to God. When you say, someone has a deep piety, there is a deep humility and a deep reverence for what God is up to. And in a lot of ways, God leading the way. And then a version of that word ended up getting used as a slur, someone's pious.
Yes.
Quit being so pious, right? And I feel like Jiminy Glick there for a second. And that was always that you're like self-righteous, you're on a high horse. But piety is this really kind of deep connection with God and really knowing your place in the universe. So Job is saying, man, when you're going through hard times, don't forget who you belong to and who's watching over you, this reverence for God, and not only that, but the path you're on, he says, your blameless ways, your hope. He's saying, stay on that path you're on, this faithful path. That will get you through. And I think those are some insightful words of, when life isn't going great, where are you going to shift the focus to? Shift it back to God. Shift it back to that place so that, as we've talked about before, rather than being mired in the muck and always thinking about the problem, what you focus on gets bigger, right? So change your focus. Don't forget your piety. Switch that focus to God.
Yeah.
And give it to him. So I really like that. And I was actually surprised. I will be honest with you. That's the first time that I've run across the word piety in Scripture.
In the actual Bible.
Yeah. So I'm probably going to go do a word search and find out if this is the only place that this shows up.
That's a good question because you just certainly don't see it a whole lot.
No, you don't. And so when I'm kind of getting ready for this, what am I doing is I'm searching through the scriptures of things that will fit kind of the theme for the day. And so, in other words, what I'm telling you is I don't read the entire Bible before I come in here to know if the word piety shows up more than once. It just so happened as I was searching, this verse popped out at me. And so I thought, I want to share it, right? So, but now I'm curious.
Yeah.
So after this, I'll actually go back and look to see if piety shows up anymore. So I'll report back into you, and we'll see what happens. But when you're discouraged, when you're dismayed, switch that focus not to the problem, but back to God. Give you some perspective.
Yes.
But now there's this another line, the first two lines of the chorus or the refrain. I sing because I'm happy, and I sing because I'm free. And Jesus had something to say about that in the Gospel of John.
John chapter 8.
Yeah.
Jesus replied, I tell you the truth. Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed.
I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. Now, I find this fascinating because there's a couple things going on in this verse. Is Jesus says, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. And where he's going with this is he doesn't say it, but he's like, just so you know, everyone is a slave to sin. He's not saying some people are.
Right.
He's saying everybody is. Mm-hmm. Everyone who sins is a slave. And then the question is anybody perfect in the room? Anybody? Okay, so this applies to you, right?
Right. And what that does, though, is it leads to that enslavement in that sense of like we're broken in that way, but Christ offers that new way.
That's right.
That path to freedom.
Yep.
And that's what God wants.
Somewhere I've heard these words that we are captive to sin and we cannot free ourselves. Does that sound familiar?
It does sound familiar. Yeah.
Okay, it's part of the 8 a.m. confession that comes out of our worship hymnal. So that we are captive to sin and we cannot free ourselves. And I think in some ways, even though we talk about Christ as our foundation, and even Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians, part of that foundation is understanding that we need a foundation. Mm-hmm. That without Christ in our lives, without that forgiveness, we are slaves to sin. And if we try to build our life on that, eventually, I'm not saying immediately, eventually it comes back and it crumbles, right? It falls apart. when we build our life on the wrong stuff. So this understanding that we are captive to something. And one of the nuances within Christianity is that those who are honest in their faith knows that they will struggle to make the right decisions, do the right thing, make good decisions when no one else is looking, that we will struggle with sin because that is our condition in life. There's not a point where, like, I have found Jesus and now I'm sinless. That is not the case.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have to talk about sin. We wouldn't have to have confession and forgiveness. Like, we would need it because, oh, now I'm a Christian. I'm perfect. The deal is we struggle on the journey.
It's important to remember that because sometimes people can get caught in that idea of, oh, should be perfect now,
Yeah.
or you should be perfect now,
Or you should be perfect now, right?
Yeah.
And so Jesus goes on this teaching. He's like, but here's the deal. He's like, if you're a slave, that means you belong to something, someone. And he says, like, if it was in an estate, let's say, he said, and you were a slave, you don't have a permanent place in the hierarchy of the family. Because if you're a slave, you're not in with the in crowd. I mean, he's describing life in first century Israel, that there were estates where people who had money, they lived nicely and they had slaves. And we disavow that, right? But he's making the point. He's like, if you're a slave in a household that's somebody that owns you, you have no real standing at all. And then he goes on to say, however, a son or a child of that estate owner, well, they're a part of the family forever. And then he says, that son, if that son sets you free, then you are free indeed. So he's kind of talking about a power dynamic. And even though it is culturally not our world, you kind of understand, like, oh, if someone in the household and you're a slave or an indentured servant or a servant and they say, okay, we're releasing you or unbinding you or whatever it is, then that freedom is real. And he's equating this to the fact that, look, you know, it's as if God has a big estate, and if you come to the Son, he's not going to be a taskmaster. Instead, he will set you free, and then in other places in Scripture, adopts you into the family, as opposed to being a servant or a townsperson or a inconsequential non-player character in God's show, God's divine drama, right? Instead, he's like, no, you're going to be moved from slave status into family status. And so when Sevilla writes, I sing because I'm happy, I sing because I'm free, why is that? Because the Son, Christ, has set us free from being captive or being a slave to sin.
Yeah.
So it's very deep stuff, but man, in like 2 sentences, Jesus like explains the whole dynamic of sin and being adopted into the family of God.
Yeah.
It took me like 10 minutes to get there, but Jesus does it in 2 sentences, right?
There's a lot of depth in there. There is
Right.
a lot of depth in there.
Right? And so we just understand that, A, we're going to struggle with sin, but because of the forgiveness Christ gave us, because of his death on the cross, because, you know, deep stuff, divine blood has the power to forgive all. What a beautiful thing. And so we have been moved from being captive to something to being redeemed, ransomed, set free, and then invited into being a part of the family of God.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, wouldn't it be just good enough to be like, oh, well, at least I'm forgiven, or at least I'm set free, but then to be adopted into what we'd consider the royal family of the universe, God's family, is like beyond expectation. So we get to eat at the King's table. And whenever we take communion, that's like a reflection of that. Mm-hmm. Like God is inviting us to dine with him. I love that.
Yeah.
So third verse. Whenever I'm tempted, whenever clouds arise, when songs give place to sighing, when hope within me dies, I draw closer to him. From care, he sets me free. Man, that line, when songs give place to sighing. I mean, what a deep
Yeah, right?
thought of there are times when the songs don't come. And instead it's a lot of sighing. And man, I think we've all been in places like that, even if we're not technically singers, that there's a lot more sighing than humming or singing, or you're in a funk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And once again she's like, but I got to go back to Jesus. I just got to go back to Jesus. And there's this beautiful verse in Hebrews chapter 2 that reminds us of how good Jesus is. And often when you're in Hebrews, it's this deep comparison between the Jewish faith and its correlation or overlap in Christianity. Some of it's very heavy stuff in Hebrews. And this, though, kind of pulls back, and you see this really beautiful thing. So let me read it to you. For this reason, Jesus had to be made like his brothers and sisters in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. And because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is also able to help those who are being tempted. That, to me, that is so beautiful, that it's the reminder that Jesus became human. Like as opposed to God saying, I see the poor estate of all these people. Just tell them they're forgiven and be done with it. That instead, this understanding of no, Jesus took on our humanity so he knows what it's like to be human.
Yeah.
So that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest. Back then, high priests were the go-between, the middlemen between the masses and God, right? So he equates Jesus to being a high priest, but then also equates him with being the sacrifice too. So he's both the high priest, the middleman between us and God, and he ends up being the sacrifice. But does this because we are reminded that even Jesus was tempted in this life, he had hardship, and then because of that, he understands us so that he can help us when we're in the same place. What?
Yeah.
It's just awesome. And so this is one of those reasons that we know that when we're struggling, when we're discouraged, when clouds arise, we know we can turn to Jesus, who says, he doesn't say, well, I can see the problem. He doesn't say that. He says, I know what that feels like. And in those moments, we need to know that someone above knows what this is like.
And that is the biblical story.
Yeah.
That's God's story for us. That's Christ's story.
Absolutely. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed that hymn today. I know I did, and certainly the story that goes with it. But we hope, it is Tuesday, so tomorrow we got Bible study, 6 p.m. We'll be online teaching from Nehemiah, and then we'll be back on Thursday in this spot and tackle yet another song and share a little bit about what's going on. And then, of course, we move into a new sermon series this weekend.
Right.
So we hope you have a good rest of your day. Stay cool out there. Keep those fans running and stay hydrated. But we love you. Take care. God bless you. And Philip is back, so I can say, Philip, take it away.